Greetings everyone, it is Zakhele here and welcome to our weekly videos. We are back. This time we are talking about unemployment, right? If you're a regular watcher of us, you must think, man, this guy is a broken record. But if you're South African, well, you should know that we have an unemployment crisis. So we can never really talk enough about it. But it is topical this week because we recently had our unemployment numbers released, right? And I don't know about you, but to me it seemed like no one seems to care. And that is concerning. That is a tad bit concerning. But, you know, for those interested, unemployment increase, right? I think it now sits at 32.9% of the South African population. Working population really is just not being productive. It is not economically active, contributing to, you know, capital creation and general prosperity of the South African society. And I like explaining it in that manner because I think it highlights what unemployment actually is in reality, right? It is just people who are not contributing to not only their own prosperity, but to the broader prosperity of the society that they are part of. And I think that's, you know, beyond the actual lack of material means, that is really the greatest injustice about it. But in South Africa, this has been our really reality for the past, I would say, 10 years, because we've had some pretty high unemployment numbers for a very long time, right? So much so I think that it has desensitized us to the numbers themselves, because really not having jobs is something that is normal in South African society, right? The economy just not growing and people not being economically active is something that we have normalized. And that is because of the structural issues in the South African economy, right? I would also argue that the unemployment figures themselves do not matter. They will not change until the structural issues are changed, right? For politicians, of course, they like the idea of having quarter-on-quarter unemployment increases or decreases, because then they get to take something to their voters, I guess, and the public in general, trying to indicate that they are doing something. But, you know, for those of us who are concerned about the substantive, you know, structural issues of the South African economy, the numbers themselves reflect something that we know to be true, right? The numbers themselves are consequences of a problem that has not been dealt with by the South African government for the longest of times, and that is really the lack of dynamism, for lack of a better term, in the South African labor market, right? You would hear, if you were to speak to anyone in the legal sphere, who would talk about how great the South African labor, you know, employment regime is. We have one of the best protections in terms of labor law all across the world, right? And then you contrast it with one of the highest unemployment rates across the world. And even though I find myself a bit apprehensive in drawing, you know, causation or a causal line between the two, there is a correlation there. There is a correlation between an increase in terms of labor legislation and unemployment, right? Because it means that your labor market is not dynamic. Your labor market is rigid due to the high levels of compliance that entrepreneurs must, you know, do in order for them to operate within said markets, right? Because if the more laws there are, the more time an entrepreneur has to spend getting to know those laws to make sure they aren't breaking them, and that time is time that they could have spent on their business, trying to be more productive, or in any other manner. And this then is what has contributed to the high unemployment numbers in South Africa. Beyond that, we have a government that dissuades investment, not only from domestic sources, but also from international sources, right? And as anyone know, capital is needed for growth to happen, right? For investment is needed for people to be able to be economically active, so that those who do not have capital are able to get access to it and then become productive. And if you have a government that dissuades private investment in whatever form and instead has a general, I want to say, rhetoric, right? The rhetoric that comes from our state is that the state is the one that knows best. In terms of economic activity, the state should be the one that directs issues. Even in public-private partnerships, it is pretty much an unspoken rule that what the state says goes, which really calls into question the partnership nature, right, of those deals. But we have a government and we have a political sphere that is heavily opposed to the private sector in whatever form, and then this translates in a lack of investment, because, you know, why would I, as a capital owner, whether a South African one or a foreign one, want to, you know, put my money in South Africa when I know that the government constantly threatens taking my property for whatever means that it deems politically viable at that time, when the government is openly hostile to the very idea of me as a private investor investing in the South African economy. As you can, like, that has a ripple effect at a collective level, because then it means that, you know, for those who control large amounts of capital, they are less attracted to, you know, the South African economy compared to other African economies that have seen, you know, large amounts of investment come in, and that has translated to growth. So, you know, you have a non-dynamic labor market, and then you have a state that is heavily opposed to the private sector, or that is hostile at times, openly hostile to the private sector, and then that will pretty much result in the unemployment figures we have in South Africa, because our economy will find it hard to grow under those conditions. Not even mentioning the other, you know, problems we have in terms of service delivery that bleeds into the operations of businesses. The most really glaring example would be, you know, electricity interruptions that increase costs for businesses, who then have to, you know, employ other means of getting power. Water interruptions. I unfortunately am based in Johannesburg, and this is something that we struggle with most of the time, right? Thanks to the incompetence, I would like to think, of my municipality in maintaining water infrastructure, right? But that effect on businesses is multiplied, because businesses that are reliant on water do not operate when there are water interruptions, and then that has an effect down the line on the income they generate and things like that. So you have, you know, these multitude of forces, a rigid labor market, an openly hostile state to the private sector, and just a lack of service delivery that makes operating within the South African market pretty difficult. And then you would not be surprised, right? Which is what I say when I said earlier on that the numbers do not matter. This is why the numbers do not matter, because these issues still persist. So, you know, if the next quarter unemployment decreases by a couple of percentage points, that would not matter as long as these issues still persist, because the structural causes behind the cause of unemployment, right, the structural causes behind unemployment in South Africa would not have been solved, and we need to solve those. And at the Free Market Foundation, we have been passionate about our unemployment rate, at least solving it, right? That is why we have introduced measures like the job seekers exemption certificate to deal with one of the aspects I mentioned of the rigid labor market in South Africa. And the job seekers exemption certificate is pretty much you as a South African, if you are unemployed, right, choosing to be exempt from the myriad of labor legislation that you are subject to as a potential employee. And we hope that one day our government will adopt this idea, right? We're pleased to see that some political parties put it in their party manifesto, but we hope that it becomes an actual governmental policy whereby South Africans who choose to be exempt from certain labor policy provisions will do so, and then increase their chances of being employed by an entrepreneur who will then not have to, you know, comply with all of those provisions that person is exempt from. And this is only just one solution, of course. If you solve the service delivery problem, and you also have a state that just changes in terms of general outlook and how it looks at the private sector, that also will contribute greatly in solving our unemployment crisis. But that is really the issues behind unemployment, and as you have heard, the solution, one of them being the JSEC that we have provided. Please do tell us what you think, right? Given that unemployment figures were released, are you maybe someone who did not care, who did not even know that they were released? I want to know. Or were you someone who's invested and you have thoughts, you're opposed to the idea of a JSEC, or you in support of it? Please tell us all your thoughts in the comments. Give the video a like, subscribe if you aren't subscribed, and always remember, stay free.